Hey, everybody, what is going on? We're back. My name's Scott Garber. I'm here with my co pilot, Andrew Petcash, on a chilly but beautiful day here in St. Petersburg, Florida. Andrew Petcash, what's going on, man? How's life treating you?
Life's great. Ready to dive into this one. Should be a good one.
Yeah, this is going to be really fun. It's been really exciting as we are winding down the year. A lot of exciting things happening in the world of sports, from youth to pro and everything in between. So today we got a really fun conversation that we're going to be having on the multi-club ownership side of things. I know there's been a lot of buzz about it in the market, but before we do that, just want to go ahead and take a moment. We're going to do a little housekeeping, and then we are going to bring on our guest and get things rolling. So first and foremost, things have been rocking and rolling over here at Profluent. So as we continue to build out our community, I encourage everybody, if you haven't checked it out, we have now 545 members. We're spanning across the whole world, and the amount of insight that we're gaining from our members and activity is just nothing short of incredible. So definitely encourage everybody to go ahead and check that out. If you like the conversations we're having here, they go even deeper when we hop in the community. So be remiss without saying that. A big thank you to Raluca, who powers all of this and makes it happen. I think that's it. Andrew, anything that I'm missing that you want to fill in?
Oh, good.
Awesome.
Let's roll.
So let's go ahead. We're going to bring on our two guests, both profound leaders in the space, going to go ahead and drop knowledge, insight, and wisdom into the multi-club ownership space. So without further ado, I'm not here to tell their stories. I'm going to bring on my man, Brett Johnson and Sanford Loudon. Gentlemen, welcome to the stage. How are we doing today?
Good. Doing well. Thank you.
Awesome.
All good. Slightly taking umbrage to you saying it's chilly in Florida when I'm dialing in from London, where it's truly cold.
Listen, we're streaming this one live on LinkedIn, and we got members over in the Northeast, and if they heard it was cold in Florida, they're gonna get mad at me. So Sanford, I don't think you're alone there. But look, I don't want to waste any time. We have a lot of ground to cover in a short amount of time. Brett, I'm gonna pass it over to you. I'd love if you could just introduce yourself, who you are, how you got into the space, and keep it brief, and then Sanford will come over your way and we'll get rocking.
Yeah, thank you, Scott, Andrew, really appreciate it. And Sanford, great to be on this panel with each other. Just briefly, a decade ago, I saw an opportunity and bought a United Soccer League franchise in Phoenix, Arizona. At that time, the pathway to Major League Soccer was coming through the USL. So I bought a team called Arizona United. I rebranded it to Phoenix Rising, brought in an incredible group of partners, including Didier Drogba. We built a stadium in a great location. From there, that was a springboard where I led the acquisition of a club in England that at the time was in League One called Ipswich Town. Brought in Mark Ashton as CEO. Mark brought in Kieran McKenna, 2 back-to-back promotions, see us now in the Premier League. And then I spent a disproportionate amount of time on a USL franchise on the East Coast, Rhode Island, where in a prior life I went to school. I'm about 4 months away from completing a $140 million stadium. And then the ownership group, we own and develop all the real estate around the stadium. So kind of increasingly domestically focusing on the USL and mixed use real estate and stadium assets.
Really cool. Really cool. A lot to dive in there, Brett. And the work you're doing is nothing short of incredible. Sanford, big shoes to fill, my friend, but floor's yours.
Hard act to follow, that one. Yeah, so I'm a partner, one of 2 partners in an investment bank called Oakvale Capital. We've been around for 14 years. We focused entirely on sports, games, gambling transactions. So last 3 years, we've advised on about $35 billion worth of deals across the sports and gaming space. Maybe the reason why I sound a bit nasal is we working through the night and announced the sale of OddsJam to Gambling.com overnight, and we sold OpenBet IMG Arena a few weeks ago. And many, many more from Genius Sports and businesses like XL Media, which we sold to Sportradar. And then on the footballing side and the sports side, we've been super active of late. Earlier this week, we announced a big capital raise from EQT into Baller. which is six-a-side soccer league, which is growing like crazy, which we also invested into about 12 months ago. And in terms of football, we've worked with a lot of the European teams and Latin American teams in particular on exits, on building multi-club models, things like that. We also have a fund, and that fund has invested about $25 million off balance sheet over the last 2 years into sports data businesses like StatsBomb, PlayerMaker, StatSports, SportsGrid, so on and so forth.
Love that. And Brett, I want to come right back to you. From Ipswich Town, it's been all over the news. A lot of people, we got Wrexham, but maybe Brett Johnson was the original. Welcome to Wrexham. I know you won't say that, so I'll say it. But give us the rundown, give us the story of that, even, and how you pull it off. Because now everyone thinks they can come in, buy these lower tier teams, and take it. What really goes into it. I think that will give us good context going forward.
Yeah. So as I stated, I lived in London after school. I ran a company based out of London for 5 years. So I always coveted the opportunity. I think I'm biased, but I think when it comes to football, there's nothing like English football. Like if you're in the space, you need to be in England. So I really was keen on trying to figure out a pathway to own a team. The real sort of game changer for me was meeting Mark Ashton. Mark Ashton, who was the CEO at the time that I met him of Bristol City, he came and presented to a USL board meeting, and I was literally blown away. He gave a master class in what it means to run an English football club. And in short, I went up to him and said, look, if I ever have the opportunity to invest in English football, I'm going to try to do it with you. And I think our success, I really put down to Mark Ashton. He's a world-class CEO. And I think where other ownership groups, if you will, I think make a mistake is they don't have a Mark Ashton running their clubs. I think a lot of people are successful in other spaces. They decide, let me get into sport. This will be fun. And it's not a hobby. You can't do this stuff remotely. You've got to have, that steady hand at the helm. And so whatever hope or expectation we had relative to Ashton, obviously with back-to-back promotions, again, I think he's more than proven that he's truly one of the best CEOs in the business and clearly one of the best in England.
Well, and Sanford, coming to you on the Baller League, right? So now we're starting to see with teams getting more publicity and attention, starting to spread into these leagues and alternative things. What's been the appetite for obviously just doing that transaction for some of the big players to come into now the infrastructure side?
Yeah, look, I think if we were to blank canvas soccer or football now, we do it so differently to how it's done across the world. I mean, look, I'm a huge Chelsea fan, funnily enough. My father-in-law has been on the board of Ipswich for 30 years. So my second club, I'm a tractor boy because I've sort of been forced to be a tractor boy. So I've been following it very closely. And I totally agree with what Brett's saying about Mark Ashton and the structure he's built there and the manager and the attention to detail, what they've achieved in the last few years. When you compare the years before, the 15 years before, where they were kind of just in the doldrums of the championship, it's been pretty incredible. But going back to your question, I think the reason why there's so much interest in Baller, and there has been so much interest in Baller, to be honest, we could have raised the capital 4 times over, is they're taking a completely different approach to football. 6-a-side, it's 15-minute halves. They have one game day a week and all the teams play on that game day. It's not about necessarily jamming a stadium with 30,000 people. It's about the streamers that surround it. So in the UK, they have the Sidemen, KSI in particular, who will be the team ambassador. And then they have managers like John Terry, Chunks. So they have a mix of ex-footballers and streamers. And I think that cocktail creates a really engaging audience. And in Germany, for example, they've been running for 2 seasons. They're the #1 Twitch channel in the world on game day because they've created that blend of football players, celebrities, and streamers. And so the Gen Z audience go nuts for it because they love the fact that it's 30 minutes of pure action and you've got high quality sport. So we always talk about it as the kind of UFC of football because yes, it's entertainment, but the focus is on the sport. And when you look at the demographic, it's 18 to 40 is the main age group, and the likes of IShowSpeed, who's going to be the ambassador, who is the ambassador for the US launch, are just promoting the hell out of it and absolutely love it.
Yeah, it's super interesting using the athlete side. And Brett, you've done that with Drogba and some others. How do you see that? We're seeing now a new announcement every probably week of a athlete getting involved with this. Yeah, every day. You know, how do you guys think about that, or what are the advantages, disadvantages? What, you know, whatever. What's that even look like?
My quick take is I think it's fantastic. You know, athletes, celebrities, they have the ability to move the needle or punch above its weight class relative to their involvement. But I do think they have to put skin in the game. You know, they literally have to write a check. It's, you know, just the days of what I would say just equity in kind. You just don't get the same buy-in on that.
I totally agree with that, by the way. I find, and these days, whenever we raise capital, whenever we invest, we insist on celebrities or sports personalities actually putting skin in the game, because my experience is they can be quite flaky and there's just limited commitment if it's just putting their name on the club. But I also think, and I'll say something mildly controversial, I think Wrexham won't be a sustainable project because of the geography of the club, and just the geography is so tricky because getting to Wrexham is an absolute nightmare. So you can't expand the audience or the fan base. And at some stage, Ryan Reynolds and co will run out of steam and not be as interested, as engaged, traveling over as much. So I think it just makes it a little bit trickier. You need to be building a club in a more sustainable way for it to be a 10 to 15 year project.
I literally say all the time, when I write my book on professional sports, it'll be the shortest book ever. It's location, location, location. And look, I guess to go back, Sanford, to your club, Chelsea, I think the brilliance, if you will, of Bowley and Clear Lake was there was no better location in the world than I think Stamford Bridge.
Yeah, totally. Look, the only challenge they have is they didn't realize that the US is different to the UK when it comes to planning permission and dealing with local authorities. And so building that new stadium is going to be a wrench, and has taken a lot longer to figure out whether they move, whether they upscale on the existing site. But I completely agree. There's no club. So when you look at Tottenham, they've built one of the finest stadiums in Europe. And that pains me as a Chelsea fan to say that, although I did enjoy my experience on Sunday watching Chelsea come from 2-0 down and winning. But really the atmosphere on Sunday night, the acoustics, everything's designed to perfection. Yeah. And Daniel Levy's whole shtick there is he wants to play sport or something, wants to use it 300 days a year minimum. And you look at Stamford Bridge, that's right slap bang in the middle of London. You can walk down the King's Road, the Fulham Road. It's so easy to get to, whereas Tottenham is a little bit off the beaten track. So you're absolutely right. I think if they can get the stadium built, it's going to be incredible.
On the location stadium track, Brett, you know, hear from a lot of capital groups of, hey, we want to come in, we want a team, but we want to do all the real estate around it. And there's obviously only so many opportunities that even exist. You've done it in Rhode Island, right? From nothing to almost done. What's that look like? What's the opportunity of it? And just honestly, just your thoughts around it.
Yeah, I mean, in short, I coveted Rhode Island because, unbeknownst to a lot of people, it has incredible demographics and didn't have a proper football club. It's a melting pot of, you know, some of the strongest immigrant, you know, love of the game, the Portuguese, the Italians, the Colombians, etc. Above and beyond it, they lost their only true sporting asset was a AAA baseball team that picked up and left the state. So sort of my entrepreneurial epiphany was very quick to buy a USL franchise and to go in and negotiate. Initially, not surprisingly, the governor wanted me to take over the baseball stadium. And putting aside the fact that you've got a diamond versus a rectangle, the geometry doesn't. The biggest issue was the stadium wasn't in a good location. It might have been 80 years ago when they built it. So I think I guess if I look back on the arc with Rhode Island, I was very focused on prime real estate that we ended up winning an RFP to develop a stadium. And then most importantly, ended up negotiating to develop all the real estate around it. So I went in with very clear sort of requirements in terms of what I needed in order to move forward. And it wasn't easy, but when we got all those boxes checked, it was a no-brainer to move forward with it. And we just completed, for those that probably aren't following it, which might be a great number of people on this call, we launched in a partnership with a local university. We made it all the way to the finals in our inaugural season. We won the Eastern Cup. I mean, so we made a decision to go out to market in advance of the stadium being completed. And now we'll be entering the stadium this upcoming season. In April, we'll be opening it. And look, I'm taking a page from Major League Soccer. What transformed football in the United States was when MLS started building soccer-specific stadiums. And to Sanford's point, with Spurs Stadium, at the end of the day, I really believe that the quality and caliber of equity of a lot of these teams comes down to the stadium. Like, said differently, not to take anything away from Angel City, but a big part of their valuation was they play in arguably the best stadium in North America at LAFC Stadium. If they played at the Rose Bowl, it would be a very different proposition if you had 80,000 empty seats day in and day out, meaning they sell 20,000. It's just not the same thing.
Interesting. Sanford, from dealing with a lot of the big players, are they looking into specific teams, into the multi-club ownership lane, or what's sort of the thoughts from a lot of the groups, whether buying gaming companies are now starting to come into leagues or teams? What's the feel around it?
So big broad question, but let me try and distill it down. So I continue to see a lot of the betting centric sports data guys exploring football teams. That's largely because of Matthew Benham and Tony Bloom and what they've achieved in their respective clubs of Brighton and Brentford. And if I just even drill down into Tony Bloom's experience, I mean, he is a lifelong Brighton fan, but what he's done with Brighton is leverage the business he built at Star Lizard, which is a betting syndicate where they deal with trillions of data points and they beat the betting markets regularly to the point that he's become a very, very wealthy guy on the back of that. And so his whole shtick at Brighton, over a longer period of time, it doesn't happen overnight, and you need patience, and probably you need to be in the lower divisions to figure it out before you get into the Premier League where the stakes are so high. But he's leveraged that data to drive player recruitment. He's used bespoke data algorithms to predict player development. And his thesis is that data, the threshold for statistics is 3,000 minutes, something along those lines. And so then he can put together very detailed performance and opposition analysis and get into what technology is required. And it's been incredible to watch the transfer activity. And I think he's just taken a stake in Hearts, and he has a stake in Union Saint-Gilloise. I probably butchered that name, but it's a Belgian team, which he took 4 divisions up, and actually to the point that they created a kind of noose for their neck on the basis he got Brighton and Union into the Europa Conference, and then had to reduce his equity stake in Union because of the inherent conflict. So to answer your question, sports data guys continue to look at acquiring other clubs if they have them already. You've got the Reitz brothers at Notts County who have a stake in Viborg. I'd say Matthew Benham is a little bit different. I would argue that Phil Giles and the guys over at Brentford don't believe as much in the concept of multi-club football. They owned FC Midtjylland, or part of it. They sold it to Anders, who was the other shareholder. And I think it's because they felt the conflicts were too tricky unless you own 100% of the club and can essentially control it. So whilst multi-club operators are becoming much more of a thing, in fact, I think there's now about 120 teams that have vested interests in more than one club. It may even be more now. Yep. It kind of happens in many instances by happenstance. I don't think a lot of these clubs are proactively sourcing other teams. I think it's because they're in that world, and then an opportunity arises, something might be undervalued. And those that are building proactively, like the City Group, they're being quite aggressive, but they probably have ulterior motives beyond just football reasons and financial reasons to build out these networks. I'll pause for breath because I'm sure Brett has some views on that, and then I can sort of talk about what I think works and doesn't work within the multi-club model.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that I think ultimately in any multi-club ownership model, every single piece of that has to find ways to pull its weight. That in other words, if it's not contributing, it can be a loss on an annual basis if it's producing talent that kind of goes up the food chain, and you can look at a potential transfer sale. And so there are ways to kind of pencil out the disparate parts of how they complement each other. But I think if you're not getting that synergy and you have a situation where several of the assets are not sustainable on some level, then I don't think it works. And I think at some point the appetite for it kind of wanes.
Now, do you share resources across your clubs at all, Brett, or what does that look like?
Not to this date. The common denominators I've got is me, if you will. I've got equity in still in Phoenix and in Ipswich and in Rhode Island. But we sent Conno Smith, who was our head coach for Rhode Island, we sent him to Ipswich to literally stick a straw in Kieran McKenna and a host of his technical teams heads and to see the way they approach training. And if you looked at Rhode Island as we progressed, and when we played a similar style in terms of playing from the back, and there are elements I'm confident that kind of Conno picked up from. But I'd love to see over time, I'd love to see more synergy between them. I mean, there is a challenge inherent in sort of the difference between the foreign calendar and American calendar, which kind of provides an impediment to really collaborating. But the challenge is, there's a real benefit in some respects playing in certain markets in the summertime. So I'm not quite sure. I could talk out of both sides of my mouth in terms of, the logic of potentially shifting the calendar. But that being said, Rhode Island's not an easy market to play in December, if you will. So the current calendar, in many respects, commercially works better for us for the time being.
Sanford, coming back over to you on your points.
Yeah, I have to say, and this doesn't play into my investment banking hat, because I'd love more teams to buy other teams and so on and so forth. But I think a lot conceptually, the multi-club model sounds great because in theory you have increased bargaining power, you can share resources, you can facilitate player movement, you can expand the brand. Red Bull would probably argue that's very much one of the drivers of how they've done things. And perhaps you can create things like salary guarantees. But actually in practice, I think most multi-club models have suffered as a result of there being different ownerships, which Brett, you've just spoken to. You've got ownerships in 3 teams, but you don't own 100% of each of those, and therefore you've just got different stakeholders wanting different things, who are not necessarily going to want McKenna to share his time helping another team that doesn't interest the fans in Ipswich. You know what I mean? So I kind of feel that you have to be so smart in the approach and organized and sophisticated, where a lot of the City Group, for example, I think 85% of the revenue comes from Man City and the remainder from 9 clubs, some of which Girona did incredibly well last year because they actually were able to lean on some of the players within the group. They had a striker who scored a lot of goals for them that last season, who's actually now left, that got them into the Champions League. Again, that created the issue where the ownership had to be reduced significantly, and there's lots of little mechanics and loan structures and convertibles that you can use to do that. But actually FIFA have really honed in on making sure that there are no integrity issues. And therefore, if you look at Aston Villa and Vitória in Portugal, they had that issue, and they were the restrictions that were imposed on them were things like there can be no player trading between the clubs. Nothing business-wise can happen between the clubs. So when that happens, it really throws a spanner in the works. So I think the model of having a top club, then potentially an anchor club, and then satellite clubs, and then developing clubs can work. but I would argue that you probably have to have them in different continents. And what I've seen that's worked quite effectively is where partnerships have been established with academies and clubs across the world, where there's reciprocal arrangements. But fandom is a difficult thing to manage, and I'd say that when Chelsea bought Strasbourg, the fans were not happy because they knew where they sat in the hierarchy of the ownership.
For sure.
Yeah, just if I can add to that, I mean, all great points. One of the areas that I particularly feel in terms of my focus on USL is I think USL is rapidly becoming the best development league in the world. That said differently, you can give better quality minutes to younger players in front of bigger audiences in USL. And I see that on the men's side and I see that on the women's side. And again, 10 years from now, I suspect that I'll still be saying that USL is the best development league in the world. And so I think staying in that swim lane, I think the challenge that Major League Soccer has is that they're trying to compete with the Premier League. They're trying to fight to be one of the top leagues in the world. That's not for the faint of heart. That's not easy to do for a host of reasons, not the least of which is the best and brightest are often trying to play in England or Spain or Italy, et cetera. And so, over time, I guess going back to the multi-club ownership, I believe strongly that over time, especially with World Cup coming back to the United States in 26, I think increasingly there are going to be deep pocket ownership groups that are going to need satellite clubs that can give quality minutes to players in a technical approach that's consistent with how they play. And so I think there'll be a lot of different models that get adopted in terms of how that, and it could just be an affiliate model. But in general, what I've learned, certainly from my time invested in England, there are an incredible amount of talent that are playing week in and week out in the academies in empty stadiums with 5 coaches on one side and 5 coaches on the next. And that's not ultimately, you don't have the luxury when you're fighting for promotion or to avoid relegation. You don't have the luxury of giving, an 18-year-old kid minutes if it's coming at the expense of results. And so that's where, again, over time, I think deeper pocketed clubs will be trying to figure out what's their pathway to give better quality minutes within their ecosystem.
Now, do you see this as we've been talking football, soccer, mainly America and Europe? Does this work anywhere else? Is there interest anywhere else? Any other sports it works in?
Do you want me to?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was actually going to say that if I was in the driving seat and I was investing and acquiring as a football team owner, I think I might consider becoming a multi-sport operator as opposed to a multi-club operator. I mean, I think there's a place for both if done in the right way. But if you consider what we were talking about with respect to Tottenham and they host 2 NFL games a season, they're trying to take more. There's an opportunity, I think, if you build a stadium at that caliber in the same way Real Madrid have done with a retractable surface so that you can play multiple sports, where in London, for example, you can have the NBA, the NFL playing on your pitch, but you can also own London franchises for the European League of Football, which is the biggest American football league in Europe. You can also have World Supercross come to your stadium. So I think there's lots of different angles to sweat the asset, and maybe being a multi-sport operator can create an economic structure that allows you to use your stadium, which is probably the most underutilized property asset on the planet. So maybe there's a slightly different angle.
No, I mean, to that point, Sanford, again, and I recognize I have no objectivity on this, but a big part of my Rhode Island strategy was to have what I am confident is the best mid-sized stadium in New England. On the day we open it, it's a 10,500 seat rectangular stadium. So the sports, the inbound interest that we have from other sports, rugby, flag football, American football, lacrosse, women's soccer, I mean, it all plays well on a rectangular field. And so to your point, you've got to find ways to program as much as possible into these stadiums. And the reality is, at least in that market, right up the road, I've got an NFL stadium where the New England Revolution, the MLS team, plays. And, they're a successful franchise, but they play in a 70,000 seat stadium. They sell 25, 30,000 tickets great, fantastic. Sitting in a stadium with 40,000 empty seats when it was built for NFL is not what, you know, fans are looking for over time. So anyway, long way of saying I completely agree with you in terms of, I think these stadiums and finding ways to program a lot more than, you just can't have 20 home games a season for a men's team. And you know, it doesn't pencil out, if you will, or in the future, it's not going to pencil out. It's not enough for some of these new stadiums.
For sure. Real quick, you know, we're talking about other sports, but I just want to bring in a question from the audience. Dave Sargent asked, do you think these MCO models will work well for, you know, women's teams leveraging scale while they're building revenue? Or, you know, how do you guys think about that as sort of a parallel without going all the way to a completely different sport?
Yeah, so I would say now the unit economics of women's football teams are embryonic and difficult to justify. If you're buying into a women's football team, I think you have to have a very long-term perspective. In the WSL, they've done a great job, and that's growing. I think revenue 2x between last season, this season. The Euros really helped that. And there's some really interesting projects across Europe in women's football. Where I would be investing, I'd be looking more at the league level at this stage, because I think the teams require big benefactors who are willing to put a lot of capital down, just because the economics aren't quite there yet. I mean, it's mind-blowing how much Angel City was sold for, and sold to people much smarter than I. So clearly there's a big play and a big proposition. And if I look at the UK and how people consume women's football versus men's football, it's totally different. It's much more family centric. The experience is incredible. The quality of the football is also getting a lot better. So to come back to the question, multi-club operators for women's football.
Yep.
I'm not sure by combining lots of teams within women's football, you're gonna, I don't want to use the expression two wrongs don't make a right, but I don't think you're going to make the economics work more effectively. I think actually at the moment it's more about focusing on the rising tide of the league, and then sponsorship revenues, media revenues, all those things start to increase and allow these women's teams to be stronger business models.
Interesting. Brett, love your thoughts on this one.
I'm bullish on women's football. I do agree. You know, I live in Los Angeles. I'll go to an Angel City game just as fast as I'll go to LAFC. It's a fantastic experience. So I intend on launching a women's team in Rhode Island. I think DeSamper's, to a very good point, is, look, if you have a bunch of, if you will, in the short term, you know, unsustainable teams, regardless of whether they're men or women, you know, that doesn't, by adding more of them together, doesn't exactly make for a strategy. So I am, as I like to say, positively obsessed with figuring out sustainability in sports investing, and, you know, trying to drive as many levers as possible. Again, for my purposes in Rhode Island, adding a women's team doubles the nights in my stadium. It's a brilliant play, if you will. USL has now launched a women's Division I sanctioned league. Like, as far as I'm concerned, it's not too different than MLS to USL, NWSL to USL. I mean, I think, in other words, I like that we can launch a team at, relatively speaking, a much lower buy-in. NWSL is going to 75 million on their franchise fees. That sucks a lot of oxygen out of the returns in the short term. Said differently, part of the success of San Diego's sale or Angel City or Portland's is that they were all effectively in for maybe $1 million, $1.5 million. It's a very different calculus when you're spending 75 million for a franchise fee, building a stadium, and then putting a front office, and then putting together a team. The price is going to have to be 400, 500 million to get any type of return when you're starting to talk about those numbers. And that's a much longer tail starting from this date out. So anyway, long way of saying, I believe strongly in the women's game. It does attract a different sponsor. On average, it attracts a different ticket buyer. So again, there's an incredible amount of synergy. But I think if you look at the WSL in England, they have an inherent advantage in terms of the stadiums already built. The geography is much easier to travel from one to the other. I mean, the United States is a big country, you know, and so trying to travel from Seattle to the East Coast, I mean, it's not for the faint of heart, as I like to say.
Yeah.
And we've had a ton of questions on, and you sort of touched on a little there, Brett, but exiting these things now, right? Like ultimately I'll reach a point where you want to get your return. What does that look like? We touched on Angel City. People got in early and they really made a lot of their money on the expansion fees, it seems, but that's tougher now. Where do you see in a multi-club ownership or even just an individual club where this is going and how you can effectively have an exit path at least?
Stanford, do you want to take that first?
Sure. So look, what I see running a few processes for tier 1 teams across the world is Chelsea, United, they were high watermarks. And what happened thereafter was a lot of the big teams tried to sell. There's a lot of American money went into the Italian league. And I would say that pricing got quite frothy. And as a result of that, in the last year and a half, you've seen across the divisions in the UK, I would say over 50% of teams down from the Championship are probably for sale, which is quite remarkable. And it's huge supply onto the market. So where are deals getting done? The deals are getting done where there's an angle that either it's so undervalued or there's a property angle, which I think is a big part of the reason why investors are going after football teams, because they can underwrite it with the property. Or to Brett's point about location, a team like a Leyton Orient, for example, perfectly positioned. It's in London, East London, near City Airport, League One, good infrastructure, well run. Those are the types of clubs that I think will ultimately find good partners because they give the potential to build a sustainable model. And the English Football League now is losing, across the English Football League, it loses in aggregate 400 million a year. It's pretty unsustainable. And so I think a couple of years ago, we had a bit of a moment. There were lots of deals being done. Now the market's a lot more selective. And there's also been a few horror stories, 777 with Everton, few situations that have scared people. And what I've seen in the processes we've run is buyers, even the extremely wealthy buyers, look at the clubs and say, okay, wait, hold up. If this is losing 10 million a year, I'm going to lose more if I get promoted, then this could be a black hole of cash. And so I need to have a lot of conviction that the fundamentals are right.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I feel too much of football is unsustainable on a global basis. And at some point the music stops and there's going to be a real compression in terms of prices. So again, from my perspective, certainly where I focus domestically is about that sustainability. And that's why the stadium ownership becomes important. That's where the surrounding real estate becomes important. And then, I'm not, if you look at my business model, I'm not kind of praying that the media rights gods come and save, USL. You've got to sign young players, give them quality minutes, and look to sell them on to bigger and deeper pocketed clubs. It's a big part of it. And on a relative basis, you got to figure out how to get to at least break even based on ticket sales, merchandise, sponsorship in general. Like again, you see USLs making some 7-figure sales of players to foreign clubs. It's fantastic, and I believe that we're in the early innings of that. But the reality is, you can't put that on a financial pro forma. You can't finance a stadium behind that. Those are one-offs, if you will. So said differently, you really need to make sure you strike a balancing act between good stadium, good ticket sales, season ticket demand, sponsorship, et cetera. And if you can get to break even there and then drive a lot of other revenue because you've got surrounding real estate, et cetera, then I think you have plenty of options in terms of an exit, because someone will look at it and say, that is sustainable. You can literally put a multiple on the profitability, if you will. But putting a multiple on a losing franchise that's going to continue to consume more capital, congratulations, you just got promoted. Now you just have the right to spend more money, potentially lose more money. So as I always say, none of this stuff's for the faint of heart. And everyone kind of goes in thinking, I get countless business plans where everyone's going to get promoted, everyone's going to sell players. And a lot of times I'm like, look, you could pick one or the other, but it's very rare. It's a Brighton is an exception to the, there's not everyone gets promoted or it gets to compete at the highest level plus sell an incredible number of players. Like you either, if you do that, you basically have you're limiting your ability to compete more often than not, obviously.
Yeah, it's great insight. And so we have two more things, try to get out here by 10 minutes before top of the hour, but multi-club ownership also going to minority stakes now. We've seen a lot of these bigger groups come in, and this is more in the NBA, MLB, etc. Any thoughts? We'll start you, Sanford, on that side of, it's not like traditional multi-club with all these synergies, but it's still multi-club ownership, and you're having stakes in multiple teams. And we've seen a ton of groups come into that space as well.
Oh, can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Owning a piece of a team, it's a quick fire way of becoming renowned and putting your name on the map. And it's also plays to kind of childhood dreams. There's all sorts of emotional reasons to do it. And I think as it relates to the NBA and the NFL and all these rules that have changed around private equity investing, these are pretty solid investments. You don't have the relegation risk. They're essentially 12 to 15% IRR style investments that will tick up over time because of the scarcity value. The only problem is the illiquidity of them. But given the interest, you would argue that you could probably do secondaries in and out of these businesses or teams over the years. So I think they're very, very safe investments. I actually think fundamentally, you put your money into that, you don't need liquidity for the next 3 to 5 years. You're going to be making more than you would if you put your money into high interest gilts or any kind of instrument of that ilk. And you get the benefit of saying, I own part of the Celtics or whatever it may be. So I think I'm not sure these minority investments have multiple minority investments in different sports teams have really much strategic value. I think they're just good investments, actually. As it relates to football, I haven't really seen anyone where there are minority investments be able to create huge amounts of synergy between those, depending on maybe the dynamics of the league or the team they're investing into. But I just think it's because these are finite assets. And once you're into sports is very much being considered as an asset class now. So companies, funds, individuals are building a portfolio within that asset class.
Yeah, I think Sanford's point, these are very, very safe investments. But investing in an NBA team, an NFL team at basically almost any valuation is a safe investment over time. But I do think if you're an LP in Arctos's fund and you've just bought a stake of an NFL team, technically speaking, yes, you could say you're an owner. Like, I promise you, when you show up at the stadium, no one thinks you're an owner. Like, you don't get anything. You don't get a T-shirt. You don't get a seat. You don't get, so there's a difference. You can buy a minority stake in a Swansea, if you will, and you're likely sitting in the director's box when you go to the game. But one, inherently, the inherent demand for what I'll call supporters of these clubs to own a stake in the Cowboys, like that, you can go out at $10 billion, $11 billion, $12 billion valuation. No one's going to blink and they'll be oversubscribed on that investment. I don't think you'll lose money, but the reality is, where does it go from there? Does it go to $22 billion and you've doubled your investment and you can't sell it anyway? It's just, there is a law of economic gravity. Historically, yes, the IRRs have been kind of double digits. I just don't know if there's not much negotiation on value. If you buy the Warriors right now at $7 billion and Steph Curry retires, is it still worth $7 billion? I don't know. So, again, you're not going to lose money on it. You're going to hold it for a decade. You're not looking for liquidity. But I certainly, and maybe it's a little bit just, I certainly think there's a lot better potential return opportunities, but they also come inherently with risk. And again, if you're a super fan, you really don't care. It's like the Green Bay Packers. You just want to own a stake if you can.
Sanford, closing out here, what's got you most excited for 2025, and anything you guys are working on you wanna shed some light on?
Ooh, that's a big question. Look, as I said before, as it relates to sports, where we're investing and spending most of our time is at the league level. That's where I feel we're going to get most bang for our buck and most opportunity for return. So obviously we've spoken about Baller League. Actually, right now, the couple of opportunities that we're working with, one is European League of Football, which is the largest American football league in Europe, which I mentioned before, and has franchises across Europe in Barcelona, Copenhagen, etc. And what I love about that business is it's profitable already in 2.5 years. So they've just been extremely effective and capital efficient in the way they've constructed the league and constructed the model. So excited about that opportunity in particular. And then there's a few projects in the hopper to look at how to regenerate big sports like rugby, for example, which I think will be very exciting in 2025. So those are the areas that we're focusing in on. And one last thing I'd say is, I think increasingly the sort of sports technology that sits around football and other sports are going to be embraced by teams, and finally leagues and teams are going to be willing to actually pay for these technologies and create a much better media betting performance experience.
Brett, will you just take us home?
Yeah, I'm very excited. We'll be going out likely later today, at the latest tomorrow, on my next capital raise. We've negotiated to acquire a significant stake of one of the largest and most successful youth soccer platforms in the United States. So it's something I've been working on for a while. Youth sports in the United States is a great vertical, if you will. I know you've spent some time on it, Andrew. It's borderline recession-proof. Families will cut a lot of their discretionary spending before, if you will, they take junior out of sports. And I think there are a lot of drivers of revenue that these platforms have, a lot more drivers of revenue, if you will, than the standard professional team. And so, it's a good mix. And then again, given what I'm doing in the broader space on the professional side, I've always coveted an opportunity to have a pathway on the youth side. So be excited to announce that shortly, Andrew. And I'm sure, with you and Scott and Profluence, there'll probably be an opportunity for us to potentially partner together on that, which would be great.
Love it. Awesome. Scott, appreciate you both. Sanford, Brett, hit you offline, and go ahead.
Yeah, no, this is great, guys. We'll pull you off. Andrew, hold on. We'll just do a recap. Brett, Sanford, you guys dropped so much wisdom for us. Thank you guys so much. All right, Andrew, what a great chat, man. I mean, you drove it. I had a question on the tip of my tongue, and you take it right off, man. But biggest takeaway, Andrew, we spend a lot of time sort of covering the gamut from youth sports all the way up through the ownership side of it. What was your biggest takeaway from the conversation?
This isn't maybe as sports related, but both of them have done incredible things across the space, billions of dollars across transactions and own things. They're just very humble, very much on like, how do we still make this a better place and sustainable and optimistic as well. So it gets me fired up to keep rolling. There's still a lot more growth across everything, but you gotta be smart, right? It's not just, this isn't just all sports is cool. Like you gotta be smart, make a good investment, and then really dive in. It's not a hobby.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think a couple things that stuck out to me. I mean, Brett talking about having, a CEO, someone that, really you could prop this up on. And I think this all comes down to extreme leadership, right? And there's, it's finding that balance of folks that truly understand it, that also have the visionary of, not being tied to the legacy, but also able to see where it's going, and finding that nice balance to continue to navigate in a really fast evolving landscape. So, I think that really stood out. And, Sanford touched on it right there at the end, but, it was this appetite for clubs to start to embrace technology, right? So, when we look at the US market, it's been fragmented from, the youth all the way in through, transferring into college, transferring into pros. And, I'm very bullish that we're going to start to flatten that curve, right? And, talent identification is going to become way more broad. And I think present new opportunities that once maybe lived in a silo. So, definitely exciting things on the horizon. And I'll sort of last thought here, but I think a lot of people talk about multi-club ownership. They talk about owning a team because it's more accessible than maybe it was ever once at this point, or, once was before. But I don't think a lot of people truly understand the good, the bad, and then the true challenges that come with it. So maybe the ugly. And so it's always neat to hear both sides of the coin as we watch, some of our constituents start to move in that arena. So Andrew, bring us home, man. Any last thoughts for our audience?
Yeah, if you're still here, really appreciate you tuning in as always. Got a ton of cool stuff coming with ProFluence in 2025, and just trying to really, really dive deep. And yeah, take a look at the community if you haven't already. Maybe it's not the best word in community, but 540 members, 100 plus investors, really trying to drive it home and help everyone win. And I think we've done a really good job so far. And you can just look at testimonials even on our website of that. So excited to work with more people closely. And yeah, 2025 is going to be a fun one.
Onward and upward, guys. You can expect a recap coming from Andrew and I, sort of on the state of the union, looking back at 24, looking forward to 25. So excited for that to come. And, again, like, you guys could be anywhere in the world, but you chose to be here. And for that, we greatly appreciate you. And as my boy Sabo said, let's go enjoy Tampa. So hope everyone has a great afternoon, and we'll see you guys soon.